My name is Carey, and I work for an educational nonprofit called Tilth Alliance. A lot of what I do at Tilth is teach classes and workshops around organic gardening and also food preservation, food preparation. I do some teaching around food waste prevention, also making compost and ecological design. And I do also like to teach classes around eating weeds, gathering wild plants, and using plants for folk medicine. I'm not a certified herbalist. I was looking through the chat and seeing what some of the things that folks were coming to class to learn about. And I think that this a class named Wild Plants for Food and Medicine is a very, very broad topic. And I think that there are lots of things that we could talk about. And so I went ahead and made some selections on what I think would be kind of some of the most important things to talk about, kind of starting from basics. So for folks that have never eaten a wild plant before or harvested a wild plant before, I think I'm going to be starting from a place of like, why are we doing this? What are some considerations? We'll talk a little bit about plant identification. I will introduce you to a few plants, and the plants that I like to focus on are plants that are pretty abundant and easy to find. Somebody said that they're eating dandelions out of their yard, and dandelion is the first plant that I like to introduce people to because a lot of folks have some like challenging relationships with dandelions, but they actually are really great plants that, sort of historically have been traveled around the world with humans on purpose as a food plant, as a medicine plant, and they've just kind of been able to establish themselves everywhere. They're pioneer species, and so they're also really good at taking care of the soil and repairing damaged soil. And so yeah, I will talk about some plants. I have, I think, just an hour and a half together, so I have I guess I'll just go ahead and start. And I am, let's see. So why are we interested? So I'm going to just move some of my controls around so that it's easier for me to see them. Why might we be interested in learning about wild plants? I tend to teach a lot of gardeners. And so when I think of wild plants in relationship to gardeners, very often it's like the weeds that are popping up in their cultivated gardens that are sort of maybe making them frustrated, or maybe, as we are maintaining gardens, landscapes, the area around our homes, if we are on some land, it can be sometimes frustrating to battle with plants that we didn't plant on purpose, and that sometimes come in our way when we're trying to have other things happen on that land. And so weeds are kind of like my first place to start from, because not all of the plants that we call weeds are tasty, and not all of them are edible, but definitely a lot of them are, and a lot of them are really useful for humans. And so I just want to put that out there as a framework that a lot of the plants that I'll be talking about are very common weeds, and perhaps maybe even noxious weeds. And so on the resource sheet, the first resource that I've given you is a link to the King County noxious weeds list, and they have like great identification website, so you can actually look through images and figure out what it is that you're dealing with for sure. I think also just learning wild plants in general, getting to have relationships with them, getting to know the plants, how they're useful for humans, what they taste like, what are the chemical constituents that are in there and that could potentially be, helpful for our bodies, I think is a really nice journey to start on. And I think, if you think about us as human creatures, evolving over thousands of years from these traditional food cultures that may have involved some agriculture, but even traditional food cultures that involve a lot of agriculture still incorporated a lot of food plants into their diet. And so for me, part of my journey and learning about my ancestry is really thinking about like, what are the food plants and what are the medicine plants that my ancestors chose and grew and ate and gathered, and what are those what are those plants and are they here? My answers is not from here, but I do come from Chinese and Japanese background. And in Chinese, traditional Chinese medicine, food is medicine and medicine is food. And so I think of them as being really intertwined. So if we were to start learning about wild plants, we might find that as we are eating them, that they may have a higher nutritional value and more flavor than some of our cultivated crops. So the crops that, if you think about something like a cabbage, where it is very sweet, it's really mild in flavor. It's got a lot of water and a lot of sugars in it. And it's still healthful for us for sure. But if we think of some of its wilder relatives, that like a wild mustard will have like a spicier flavor. It's going to have stronger plant chemicals in it, and it may have more nutrients. It may have even some medicinal properties. I think too, if we're out gathering wild plants, if we are harvesting the weeds from our garden instead of like spraying them with chemicals, we can actually create a healthier ecosystem, and we can save money either from, if we are harvesting wild plants, that basically that is, we're not paying money for those plants. We're maybe paying for them in time and effort and learning, but we could actually, depending on how much land and how many plants you have access to, you could potentially save a lot of money incorporating wild plants into your diet and into your medicine cabinet. If you're a gardener and you're trying to find uses for the weeds, sometimes it is more fun to talk about it as harvesting as opposed to weeding. So this image right here, this is a weed that is very common if you have a garden or have done any land care in our area. You might recognize it. This pops up January, February, usually in the middle of winter, very early spring. It's called shotweed, and it is also called wild cress or hairy bitter cress. And it is a pretty frustrating weed. It has this big, this like little leafy rosette here in the image, but it'll very quickly send up a flower stalk and then these long pods. And if you catch it in that phase when you're trying to weed it out, when the pods are dry, they'll shoot seeds at you, and that's why it's called shotweed. Anyways, if you get it before that in the leafy stage, actually really delicious. It tastes like watercress. So I think also too, even if you're not a gardener, or you're not doing any sort of land care, I think being out with plants, learning plants, and having some kind of relationship with plants as you learn them and identify and then interact with them, I think is a really important part of being a human creature, to have an ongoing personal interaction with our ecosystems and with the outdoors. I think that is a really important thing for us all humans to have. And I think that interacting with plants and getting to know them, and sometimes harvesting them and bringing them into your kitchen, can be a really nice way to continue that interaction. I have also a quote here from Robin Wall Kimmerer. She wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and it's also one of the things that I put on the resource sheet. It's a really lovely book, and I think that everyone should read it. But for me, it answers some of that why we want to learn wild plants. But she says, so it's a sign of respect and connection to learn the name of someone else, a sign of disrespect to ignore it, right? We know that as people. And yet the average American can name over 100 corporate logos and less than 10 plants. And is it really a surprise then that we have accepted a political system that grants personhood to corporations, but has no status at all for wild rice and redwoods? So if you're a person that cares about plants, learning the names of plants and animals is a powerful act of support for them. So when we learn their names and their gifts, it opens the door to reciprocity. And I think for me, that's a really valuable way. This quote kind of calls to me for how I interact with the land that I live on, the land that I steward, the land that I grow my food in, the land that I work on, the land that, where my house is. And so just how am I having a relationship with the land and the plants, the animals and the waters. I also too just want to acknowledge that I am coming from Seattle, zooming in from Seattle. If you live anywhere in the Puget Sound region, you and I are both on Coast Salish land, and that the lands and this waters of this place where we live and work and do land stewardship. If you take care of a garden, or even if you're a landowner, that these lands and waters have been cared for and stewarded by humans in this area since time immemorial. In numbers, that's something like 8,000 to 10,000 years before European settlers arrived. And so, I think it's important for me to just to do, and also to invite you to learn the histories of the people and the lands and the waters of the place that you live, garden, and gather food, and find out how you can support Indigenous people and work to heal harms done to the people, to the lands, and to the waters of your place where you live. And if you're in Seattle area, if you're in Puget Sound region, I have on my resource sheet, I'm going to send you some ways that you can learn more about in Seattle, Duwamish and Muckleshoot tribe, and then some more information from Robin Wall Kimmerer, but some images. This is a historical image of Coast Salish woman gathering food, and then this is also a modern image of Coast Salish person gathering food as well. So I just felt like I needed to acknowledge that, and hope to invite you to learn more about who are the people that have been caring for the place that you live since time immemorial. Some other considerations: if we are going to go out and harvest a plant and then eat it, or bring it into our kitchen and cook with it, or make medicine with it, there are actually loads of considerations, and this may be one of, very important slide to, I'll probably go through this fairly quickly, but some of the considerations are: where are you? Like, what is the land that you're on? Is it private property? Is it public property? Do you have permission to be there? And do you have permission to harvest? And if you don't have permission, who can you ask for permission? And I think we have this idea of like public and private property. There's sort of two very different ways of making the distinction about who can give that permission. There is, in the resources, I'll give you an article from T.A. Beloit from his blog, where he kind of wrangled up a lot of the, from all around the Pacific Northwest. There's a whole list from Washington State of, from a state perspective, like what are the different kinds of public lands and what are the regulations for harvesting on them. If you have access to private property, I live in the city of Seattle. I live in a residential neighborhood, and I know a few of my neighbors, but not all. And there are, as I walk through the neighborhood, a lot of apple trees, a lot of plum trees, even herbs like dandelions growing in the parking strip. There are very few instances where I would feel comfortable just going and grabbing something and harvesting it for my own, without really being thoughtful about who is taking care of that land, who is even in sort of like the city parks, or the kind of in Seattle, we have park stewards that are volunteers that care for some of these natural spaces, and they're taking care of that land. Like, who am I to go in and start harvesting things from this land that other volunteers are caring for? So finding a place where you are able to do some of that land care, I think can help you gain permission, and help you gain access to some of these places where plants are growing. Community gardens are a great place. If you don't have your own backyard or your own garden, getting involved with a community garden can be a nice place too. Another consideration that I think about a lot is like sort of urban versus natural ecosystems. I tend to spend a lot of time in urban ecosystems, and so a lot of the plants that I know very well are what we would consider weeds. And I'm also aware of things like pollutants and contaminants. They'd be very different probably in an urban ecosystem than in a natural ecosystem. I think there are different considerations between the two, and what kind of plants you're accessing. If you're out in natural ecosystems and you're harvesting native plants, you know, some of those plants, like they may be very important for feeding the other animals and creatures that are in that ecosystem. And so thinking about if you're taking something from a place, something from an ecosystem, like who are you taking it from? Like who else besides from humans, like who else use those plants, and how is the work that you're doing or the harvest that you're taking affecting the rest of the ecosystem? I think is very important to think about when you do any harvesting, whether it's wild harvesting or and same thing with weeds. You know, if it's something in your garden and you're going to be weeding that out anyway, sometimes, you know, like, okay, we'll take it all. But if you are out in you know, an ecosystem where you're not, the job that you're doing is not weeding, you want to keep that colony going, you're not going to take it all. You're going to make some very different decisions. I think thinking about pollutants and contaminants, what happened, like what is the history of that soil, what's connected to it, what's upstream from it, what's down, like upwind from it. You know, thinking about how pollution travels. I live in between Martin Luther King Jr. Way and Rainier Avenue South, and both of those are very busy for traffic streets. And so I'm much less likely to harvest from those busy streets, but I might be taking things from more kind of walking around the neighborhood or in my own backyard, or and thinking about even just like when people are walking their dog, if there is like a big lush patch of chickweed growing up against the fire hydrant, the reason probably that it's so big and lush and green looking is all that nitrogen from where the dogs pee all the time. So being kind of conscious about what might be happening in that place, even if you can't see it. So just some considerations. Yeah.
I have a quick question. Are these slides going to be also available where we can send people, like your PowerPoint slides?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I can probably make them available. All of the words are going to be written on the outline. It just may not have the images as well.
Okay.
But yeah. Let's see. Sustainability of the plant, colony, and ecosystem. So that's kind of like what part of the plant are you taking, and how many of the plants are there, and how important is that colony to the ecosystem. I think if there are many plants, taking a few is okay. Also thinking about the part of the plant that you're harvesting, right? If you take a leaf and there are many leaves, it's going to be probably not that traumatic to the plant. If you are harvesting the root, you're literally taking the whole plant. That plant is gone. It's not going to come back. So it's a very different thing to take a leaf from a plant than it is to take a root. Same thing with berries. You know, berries are meant, their plants make their berries delicious so that animals, including us, will eat them to spread seed. And so you're not doing a lot of damage to the plant to harvest berries, but there may be other creatures in the place that also rely on those berries. So just kind of being thoughtful about all of those things. And then of course, 100% positive identification. I think that it is, you know, part of my job, huge disclaimer to be like, please don't put anything in your mouth, cook any food for your family from a plant that you don't know. And this is the part where it comes up. It's like we learn about plant identification. We start to have a relationship with that plant. And maybe even the first few times we see it, we don't harvest it. Maybe we can take a little taste. This is field guides are a great help to bring out with you. Also, other people that know can be a really helpful guide too. So I think there's two pieces to that for me. One is knowing a little bit about botany and learning about plants and how we identify them. And then this other piece of like, you don't have to know all the plants. It's overwhelming to think like, I want to just go out into the forest and know all the plants that I'm looking at. But instead actually makes more sense to like pick one or two plants that you're curious about, learn more about them, form a relationship with them, know how to identify them, know like how they grow, what they look like through the year, who they're feeding, what their niches in the ecosystem might be. And then, you know, like, I think that identification comes more naturally that way in where like, if I there's almost 100 people here in this room, and I would not even remember any of your names, even were I to spend this entire 2 hours trying to learn them. But I know my neighbor Paul really well because I see him every day. He helps pick my kids up from school, right? Like we have a strong relationship, and I could recognize him from the back of his head if he was wearing like 7 different color shirts 2 blocks away, because I know him so well. And so I think that that's a way to get started with plant identification, just starting with 1 or 2 plants and get to know them really well. Part of plant identification, I think just a few more details, is that leaf shapes can be deceiving. The image in this picture here, this is Amaranthus retroflexus. It's we also call it red root pigweed, but it has a very common leaf shape, and it could be mistaken for a lot of things. The way that botanists put plants together in plant families is really around the reproductive parts. So looking for flowering parts, looking for fruiting parts, looking for seed pods, those are going to be helpful ways to be very distinctive, be able to very distinctly identify in conjunction with like, what is the, like, how are the leaves coming out of the stem? What is the shape of the stem? All of those things together. But reproductive parts are going to be I find the most helpful and distinctive for identifying accurately species. I think using trusted sources and cross-checking. So just because one person says a thing doesn't make it true. It may be true to that person, but also I know, especially from the internet, that a lot of people do cutting and pasting for something that they've learned on the internet or learned from a book, but haven't necessarily had true life experience themselves. And so really finding some trusted sources for plant identification and for plant usefulness. And then also cross-checking with another source that also says a similar thing and maybe not in the exact same language. And I have a few resources on the resource sheet for like plant ID and that sort of thing, but there are tons and tons of books, especially just in the last, like, I feel like 10 or 15 years, a lot more books about like harvesting wild foods have come out, and the library has tons of them. So check out a few, see which ones you like. And then just also a note about the difference between common names versus botanical names. Common names, I like both of them. I like, as I said, I like to have like relationships with the plants that I know. And part of that is knowing all of their names. I like to know their names in other languages. But common names can be very useful for sometimes knowing what a plant is for. Like if there's a plant whose common name is knitbone. And so like, oh, okay, that's a plant that's going to be a healing plant for me. Or lungwort. Okay, that's a plant that I know historically was used for lung conditions, right? So some of those names, or pigweed, okay, like that plant is probably going to be super nutritious because the pigs like to eat it, or chickweed, the chickens like to eat it, right? That sort of thing. So they can give us some hints about what is going on with that plant. Botanical names are helpful because it is sort of universally used across the globe. Each species has its own distinctive name, and they use a binomial nomenclature. It's a 2-parted name. This plant right here, a common name, I would call it amaranth, weedy amaranth, wild pigweed, red root pigweed. It may have many other names also. There are tons of other plants that are also called pigweed. Purslane is also called pigweed, and other things. And so you could go to a community garden and 3 different gardeners will tell you 3 different plants that they call pigweed. But this plant is also called Amaranthus retroflexus, and this is the only species that's ever going to be called Amaranthus retroflexus. And so it can be useful in being very distinctive. And if you get to learn some of the Latin, that you can actually, some of those names can actually tell you a thing about it, like what color the leaf is, or how big the leaf is, or how many leaves it has. Some of the species names can kind of give you hints of that too, if you can do some research into the Latin names. Let's see. So aside from knowing just the edible plants, I feel like it's also very helpful to know the poisonous ones. And there are really just a handful, I think, in our area of plants that are so poisonous that just a very little amount will do a lot of damage. But this is one of them, which is called poison hemlock. It's different from the tree hemlock. This is a plant that's in the carrot family, and you can see that the leaves and the flowers can be a little bit reminiscent of a wild carrot or a wild sweet Sicily or Lomation. There's like a lot of plants that are in this family that look kind of similar, but this one can be really dangerous. Even a small amount of it can do a lot of damage to a human, and so I like to, if we were to encounter this all together in the wild, I definitely would show you all of the ways to identify it. Another resource that I'm going to give you is the Burke herbarium, which is online plant ID. It's really helpful, and you can look up Conium. They do their searches by botanical name, so Conium maculatum, and there's like 50 or so images of this plant. Some of the distinctive characteristics are that there's a purple splotchiness to it. It's not the only plant that has purple splotchiness, but that can sometimes be helpful to distinguish it from other plants that may look similar. So know some of the poisonous plants. That can be really helpful. Not that you're just going to go out and randomly start putting plants in your mouth, but it is helpful to know, I think. Another thing to learn about and to be curious about is the plant life cycles. So as we enter into this journey of having a better relationship with plants so that we know them really well, knowing what the plant looks like all through the year. If you're harvesting that plant for food or medicine, knowing which parts are useful and knowing when is it best to harvest those parts. And plants can have different life cycles. Plants can be an annual, where they're growing from seed to creating their seeds and dying all in the span of a year or less. Biennial, a lot of the roots that we gather, like burdock, tend to be biennial. So, and even our cultivated plants, like carrots and beets, the first year they make the taproot, the second year they send up a flower spike. So knowing that biennial life cycle can tell us, like, okay, well, if I know they're using all that root energy to make that flower spike and then die back, I want to harvest it before I see the flower spike because I want to get the root energy. So we harvest our carrots before they send a flower up. We harvest our beets before they send up a flower up. And same with something like burdock, which is also biennial root that we might harvest. There's also lots of perennials, plants that live their life over many, many years. And then we have also like trees and shrubs. So, getting familiar with that terminology, getting familiar with those plant life cycles, and then each individual plant, knowing what it looks like in its baby stage, what it looks like when it's flowering, what its seed pods might look like, can be helpful. I like to pay attention to the seasonality, same as plants that I'm growing on purpose for food. I plant my peas in the spring, or my actually planting some peas now for a fall harvest. And I plant radishes in the spring, but I wouldn't plant them in the middle of summer because it's too hot for them. So knowing that plants have seasonalities, it's good to, kind of, if you are walking around your neighborhood or walking around your land, knowing what's popping up at certain times of the year and make a record of that. I like to have like just a calendar book that I keep records of what, I call my seasonal rounds. I know that in springtime, early spring, we're going to see nettles just shooting up. Summertime now is a time for purslane and shotweed. We're only going to see kind of in the winter, those very cool times of year. I just want to put a shout out there for eating more greens. A lot of the plants that I talk about, a lot of the weeds that we find, especially like weeds that we're weeding out of our cultivated spaces, are actually really healthful leafy greens. And I think also part of some of the health and digestive issues that Americans have in our modern food culture and our modern cuisine is that we really have a lack of eating leafy greens. And leafy greens are not only, I think, helpful for our digestive system, but also are full of like most of the vitamins and minerals that we take a vitamin supplement for. So they're like, of course, it varies from leaf to leaf, but leafy greens in general are really good sources of things like calcium, potassium, iron, folate, even vitamin C, even beta carotene, and of course, fiber. There also have been a lot of studies on leafy greens showing that like leafy greens can help improve insulin sensitivity and lower glucose levels. They are full of antioxidants and polyphenols, which can fight disease and inflammation. And some of the chemicals like chlorophyll that are found in plants can have even in studies been shown to protect against types of cancer and detoxify the body. So those are, these are foods that like we have in our traditional cultures eaten much, much more of, and in our more recent modern food culture eat much, much less of. And so some of, I think, the diseases that we have in our bodies that stem from nutrient deficiency can be sort of curbed or alleviated with some eating more leafy greens. I just want to put that out there. We don't need enough. I don't eat enough. I need to remember to eat more leafy greens. And leafy greens are available very often in the spring, but also year round, depending on what the plant is. So it's good to know that there are leafy greens available all year round. Right now, amaranth is a big one that's happening right now and in cultivated places. Also digging roots. So this is burdock. I was talking about burdock a little bit earlier. And burdock is a pretty common root or plant, wild plant. People consider it a weed. Don't spray your burdock to get rid of it. Try digging up some of the roots, because this actually, it's a hard dig to get, but these roots here, this is dandelion, but this root here, this is burdock. And burdock is actually a cultivated vegetable in Japan. It's called gobo, and it tastes really good. It's earthy in a way, like you may not be into it if you're not used to eating it, but like same with beets, some people are like, I'm not into beets because it tastes like dirt. Gobo tastes kind of like dirt, but like in a very charming way. I am a huge fan of it. It's not bitter at all. I love it. And so let's see, there's other plants too where we would possibly be digging roots. Digging roots usually is in what I would consider the dormant season. So when the plant is putting its energy, it's not putting its energy out into leaves, it's not putting its energy up into fruits or seeds, it's drawing it back down to kind of go through the winter. Plants tend to kind of like buckle down, batten down the hatches. And so that like fall, winter, early spring is really when I would be, and that's when the soil is moist and easy to dig too. So that's when I'd be digging roots. And then tons of nuts, fruits, and seeds out there. This is here hawthorn, so different kinds of like apples and crab apples, even feral apples. I live in a neighborhood where like starting now, apples just rain from the sky and roll into the street. And some of them are kind of buggy, but we can use that to make applesauce. Also acorns, they take a little bit of processing and a little bit of practice and some time, but I think acorns have been a dominant food source for humans in a lot of places in the world for a really long time. And so going back and learning relearning how to process acorns can be like a really fun, a very satisfying thing to practice and to relearn. And other smaller seeds too. This is plantain. I've got a slide where you can take a closer look at plantain. Plantain, plantago, the herb, not plantain, the banana, but this is a wild plant that you find very often in a lot of places, even in the lawns. People try to dig them out from their lawns, but this is the broadleaf plantain or frogleaf plantain, Plantago major, and you can pull the seeds right off. I do this thing, I kind of roll the seeds out of their little shells, winnow off the shells or the chaff, and then you end up with all these tiny little seeds, and they're really they have a lot of soluble fiber in them. Actually, like the psyllium powder, which is like what is in Metamucil, which is a fiber supplement, is made from a kind of plantain. And so you can soak those seeds and they'll get kind of gelatinous, almost like chia seeds will. So you get those tiny little things, you can, throw them in your baked goods just like you would put poppy seeds. I also am a big proponent of adding flowers to food. I think it's a really fun way to celebrate the spring and the summer when blooms are all around. Not all flowers are edible, but there are a lot that are. So if you know a place to find violets or borage, calendula, even comfrey flowers, Oregon grape, they're a little astringent and very tart. But like mustard flowers, or if your kale or collards in your garden are going to flower, going to bloom, you can eat all of those. Dandelion flowers edible, chicory flowers edible, daisies edible. And sometimes there are some plants where even the whole rest of the plant is poisonous, but the flowers are not. Like wisteria, the whole plant is poisonous, but the flowers, anyway, so this is just like the flowers from my kale that had gone to bloom. I just like put a bunch of flowers on top of all of my food. When flowers are blooming everywhere, I just like add it to everything. Even a crummy old ramen. Okay, now is when I have some plants to talk about. As I said, I always like to start with dandelion. Dandelion is one of my favorite plants. She's available everywhere. She is a hard worker. Dandelion is another plant, is also one of the plants that is sort of most maligned, sprayed the most with chemicals, having the most frustrating relationship with humans, especially I think when it comes to people in lawn care. And I think that with lawn care, people tend to try to grow a monocrop of grass. And in nature and natural ecosystems, it's very rare that you see just one kind of thing growing, one kind of plant in an ecosystem. Usually there are lots of communities of plants, a lot of diversity, because that's what resilience looks like in nature and natural ecosystems. And so with grass, which has the grass that we grow for, you know, in our lawns, like sod, where like it naturally has a shallow root system. It's not digging really deep down. It's taking a lot of nitrogen and a lot of food, a lot of water from the soil. And so what dandelion's trying to do is when dandelion pops up in your lawn, you know, nature sees this sort of damaged hardpan soil and is trying to actually see this big taproot. She's trying to break up that hardpan soil and open it up, and then mine minerals from deep in the soil, put it up into the leafy body of this plant. And when the leaves die back and break down, they're creating basically like a top mulch, and breaks down and becomes like organic matter at the top of the soil. So they're bringing nutrients up from the bottom and then making it available and really trying to repair the soil from above. And so that's why I say dandelion is a hard worker. And actually the leaves taste bitter. They're going to taste less bitter in the spring, early when they first start popping up. And again, like when the best time for, in a generality of things, the most general sense, it's not always true, but the best time to harvest leaves is when the plant is focusing on its leaves. Once they start sending up flower stalks, then they're going to be concentrating on the flowers, and maybe the leaves are not going to be quite as tasty or not quite as full of sugars or carbohydrates or nutrients or whatever. But the cool thing about dandelion is you can eat the leaves early in the spring. Whether you like to eat dandelion leaves or not, you can also eat the flowers. And when the flowers pop up in spring, I love to harvest these flowers, and like you can pull out all of those petals and add them to pancakes and muffins and baked goods. And then also the root. So I dig a lot of dandelion roots during the winter time when it's again, like in the dormant season, it's put all its energy into its roots. And I like to I have a slide about it, but I like to grind the roots, and I'll like spray them off with a hose, and then I'll chop them up, and I'll like kind of pulse chop them in the food processor, and then I'll roast them in a low oven, like 200 degrees, until they're almost dry. And then I turn the oven heat up just a little, like 350, just for like 10 or 15 minutes to get a little bit of roast on them. And then that I use like during the winter time when I want something warm to drink that's kind of like coffee, but it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and I shouldn't be drinking more coffee. That I do a lot of dandelion roots and harvest them for tea, or it's actually like a decoction. You like simmer it, and sometimes I'll put like ginger and other chai spices in there. It's really nice. Drink it with milk and maple syrup. That's my favorite. And dandelion has a lot, like some of the medicine of dandelion is that it's really helpful for digestion, and the bitterness helps like your body kind of get all of your digestive fluids going. The root tends to be less bitter, especially if you roast it, but it still is like a really good tonic for like if you had like a heavy meal, or you just need to like get some of the stuff moving. Dandelion is really good for that. There are some other plants that people call dandelion or false dandelion, and so I just put this slide together to show you some like very tiny details that you would have to notice to be able to distinguish. And this is like a practice in plant identification, right? So dandelion is this on the right. You can see it's got toothed leaves. The stem is hollow, and when you pluck the stem of the flower, the stem of the flower is hollow, and when you pluck it, it'll ooze a little bit of latex or white sap, and its flower is it flowers just on one stem that comes all the way straight from this, what they call a basal rosette. These leaves are not hairy at all. And then on the left here, this is something people call false dandelion or cat's ear. The leaves are very hairy. They're also toothed, but more of like a lobe than a sharp tooth. And then you can see here, the stem is solid. It's not hollow at all. And there are, if we were to look at this stem, there might be several flowers branching off from one stem. So just like those tiny little details might be the difference between one plant or another. And then, here's just the beginning of my roasted dandelion root tea. So I dig a bunch of roots. Here's a bucket of roots. And then I shoot them off with a pressure hose. And then I cut the tops off and use them for something different. Sometimes they go into the compost pile. And then I chop up all these roots, and like a 5-gallon bucket will just end up making, just like 1 or 2 quart jars, but it's totally worth it. It's my favorite thing. Chicory, which is another plant that's very closely related. And actually, if you were to buy the cultivated vegetables that are called radicchio, endive, frisee, escarole, I think, also Italian dandelion. Like if you're buying dandelion greens from the grocery store, it's probably actually a chicory. They have a very similar flavor profile. Their leaves can be hard to distinguish. You can see that this is probably dandelion in the back, but some chicory will have very like lance-like leaves, and some of them will actually be lobed or toothed like a dandelion, but their flowering structure is very different. So chicory has blue flowers. There are multiple flowers all the way up the stem, and so you can identify chicory from its reproductive parts. Like you can see it doesn't have blooms on it now, but I can tell that this was chicory. And so I know, like in the winter, if I want to dig chicory roots, which I have a similar flavor profile and similar kind of medicinal function as dandelion, in some regards, I might, and sometimes I mix the two together. I might look for these like kind of old flower and seed stems, and then know that below it is chicory. If you've ever had like Vietnamese style coffee or French Louisiana style coffee, that Café du Monde is a mixture of coffee and roasted chicory root. And that's why that flavor of that coffee tastes different than just regular ground coffee. Chicory. Plantain is one of my favorite plants. This is a good one to know, especially it's a great like emergency first aid plant, because this one is good for bee stings and wasp stings. It has antihistamines in it, brings down swelling, and it's kind of drawing out, can draw out some poisons. And so I find it very helpful for bee stings out, like field first aid. Also, I find it helpful for like nettle stings too. Anything where your body is like dealing with a histamine reaction. And I've even like juiced some of these leaves and drink little small amounts of it through the like seasonal allergy season. But I also like to eat the seeds from this. So there's two kinds that are regularly like very common in our area. This is the frogleaf or the broadleaf plantain, Plantago major, and then this is the lanceleaf plantain, which is Plantago lanceolata. And one of the things that can help to identify plantain is that it doesn't have like a lot of leaves have like a main branching stem, and then like the veins kind of come off from this main stem and branch off. But these ones come, and then as they get to the base, they run all the way parallel down. So that can be a helpful ID clue for plantain. When you look at the back of the leaf, especially if it looks like a broad leaf, but the leaves aren't branching, they're actually parallel all the way down the stem. I also like plantain is also useful to eat as a leafy green, as it tastes better as a cooking green, or what they call a pot green, mixed with other things. It can be a little astringent, but I am used to, I like the taste of plantain. I like chewing it because I often will show people how to make a spit poultice, where like if you have a bee sting and you find plantain, pull a leaf off, you know, you can chew it up, or you can mash it between a rock to get the juices out of it. And then you put that on your bite or on your sting. And then if you have like a Band-Aid or something else to like hold that plant on, you've just made medicine. It's called a poultice. You're like taking a leaf, breaking it down so that the juices come out of it, and then applying it directly to the area of concern. And it's really helpful I had a wasp sting and I put plantain on it, and it never really, and like it worked really well for me. It never ended up having to take any kind of like Benadryl, antihistamine. The swelling never really like fully showed itself, and in 3 days it was gone. So plantain, yay. See, amaranth. So this is this stem is looks a little bit bent, but usually they grow straight. Amaranth, this is the red root pigweed, Amaranthus retroflexus. And amaranth species around the world are foods that people have been eating for a really long time. So it's a pretty common leafy green that sometimes is grown on purpose. You can see there are varieties of amaranth that are grown just for the leaves. There are varieties of amaranth that are grown just for the seed. This is a variety that tends to be kind of weedy in our cultivated areas. So if you are in farmland, if you have a garden, you might recognize this amaranth, weedy amaranth, red root pigweed. It is really highly nutritive. It's better for you probably than spinach. It is not, it's, you know, anyways, pretty, if you have this plant, you know it, and usually gets weeded out and thrown in the compost. It's probably really good for your compost pile, but it's also really good for your body. So eat it. There are some plants that can look very similar. As I said earlier, when we met amaranth, that this leaf shape can be fairly common, right? This is tomatillo, which is another plant that tends to be a little bit weedy in cultivated places. Community gardens often have tomatillo popping up wild. Farmland, if they've ever grown tomatillos ever before, probably tomatillo grows wild there too. The key thing here is to notice the difference between the reproductive parts. So amaranth, I don't know if you can see it closer in this picture, but you can see it's just this like fuzzy head. And sometimes it has very tiny, not very showy flowers in there. Whereas the tomatillo has these bell-shaped nightshade looking flowers that, you know, they're very big and very showy. And so you can see, if you look at the reproductive parts, it's very clear to know the difference between the two. And so I think that is, you know, kind of helpful identification piece there. You would not want to eat tomatillo leaves, I don't think. They're in the nightshade family, which has some very edible plants and some very poisonous plants. So unless somebody tells you you can eat it, probably you should just steer clear. But the amaranths, pretty much all of them you can eat. This is another pretty common field weed, but also you can see it growing in gravel. You can see it in like the parking strip. You can see it in the parking donut. You can see it in the parking lot. It's pretty common weed. It is very nutritive. It's also it comes out in the summertime, in the heatest hot summer. It's a succulent, and so there's moisture in there. And actually, the word that I use, which sounds kind of gross, is mucilaginous, but it has this like sometimes a little bit of a slimy, like you crunch into it and it's juicy and a little bit tart. And then there's a little, some more than others, but there's a little bit of sliminess, and that not as slimy as like okra, but there's that bit of that mucilage or that sliminess is actually cooling to your body. And so this weed pops up in the summertime. It's good for us to eat it in the summertime because it's cooling for our body, gives us moisture, and brings down our temperature. And it is it's crunchy, and it is feels thirst quenching too, because it's like crunchy, juicy, sometimes a little bit tart. And this is another wild plant that is cooked, used as a food in tons of places around the world. And I like to learn their names. In Spanish and Latin American countries, it's called verdolagas. And they use it I think in Mexico, there's a dish where it's cooked with pork, but you can even chop this up, eat it fresh. You can cook it as stir fry. People also often cook it with eggs. So it's also super helpful because it has, it's really high in omega-3s, which are like proteins. Fatty acids. Omega-3 fatty acids is, it's really high for a plant, I think. Anyways, so it's supposed to be really healthy for you. It tastes really good. It's like a nice one to know during the summer. Oh, here's some resources. Oh, good. I put this resource sheet in here just to remind me to get to the part of the resources. I put a few more slides at the end because I wasn't sure if I'd had time for them. So I'm going to push forward here, just show a few more slides, and then we'll come back and look at resources really quick before we go, because I think we got some time. Hawthorn. So hawthorn is, right now we're kind of in between the bloom and the berry, but hawthorn, there's a native hawthorn, Crataegus is its botanical genus, and then Crataegus douglasii, which is the native, has blackberries, and it's actually ripe right now. This is a more this is actually considered a noxious weed, so it's probably more common that you'll see this one. This is the European hawthorn, Crataegus monogyna, and this is a very long history of being used as food and medicine. Again, all around the world. This is the European variety. It's been often used for heart medicine, to strengthen heart tissue. So if your heart beats too fast or too slow or too hard or too soft, this is an equalizer of that. And in Chinese medicine, haw is used a lot as well. And also in Ayurvedic medicine, haw is used a lot. So a lot of our herbal traditions, medicinal traditions, whether it's like Indian, Chinese, Western, traditional Western herbalism, use this plant. And it is around a lot of places. It is one of the plants that they may control with chemicals in some places. So just be aware of that. If the tree doesn't look good, like it's suffering or has some disease or it's wilting, like don't steer clear of it. But if you know this plant or have it in a place where you have easy access to, it's a good one to know through the seasons. The leaves, when they're first coming out, are edible. The blooms are edible and used for medicine. And then the fruits too, they'll be ripe in September. So right now you'll see fruits on them. They'll probably be green or just starting to turn orange, but you want to get them when they're really, really ripe. Apples and crab apples. These are, especially if you live in an urban environment, these are everywhere. And if you see a resource that's just rolling into the street and getting run over, see where they're coming from, ask if you can have some and make use of them. We have native crab apples too. I think the regular domestic apple is Malus domestica or something like that. And then our native crab apple is Malus fusca. And flowers. I always like to talk about flowers. I don't know if folks recognize any of these, but this is just your lawn daisy. Those are super cute, edible, put them in a salad. Roses and then rose hips that come afterwards have long been used in beauty products. Again, also heart medicine is tonifying of tissue, so it pulls tissue together. So if you think about like a facial toner or any skincare products where you want to keep your beauty lasting long, rose has long been used for that. Rose hips come after when they ripen. They're full of vitamin C. This is honeysuckle. This is also considered noxious sweet. This Japanese honeysuckle has been used in traditional Chinese medicine, but also just it smells lovely. And I make like cold water infusions. I have got honeysuckle growing all around the perimeter of my house, and so all during the summer, this smell reminds me of home. So we make honeysuckle tea. We sip the back of the honeysuckle. I've made like honeysuckle butter before. Any way that you can get that scent into a thing, it's delightful. More flowers, chicory flowers. They are a little bitter because they taste like chicory. So just be mindful of that, but they're super cute to put on a cupcake or decorate a cake. I don't know if you recognize this plant, but this is pineapple weed. It is really closely related to chamomile, but it grows in the driest, graveliest places. Just make sure it's not like where the car runs over or where the dog's peeing. But these are the flowers. They don't really have showy petals on the outside, but you can squish it and smell it, and it smells like pineapple. It smells like if a pineapple soda was mixed with chamomile tea. And it's, anyways, red clover. This is another one that's like really common to find. And red clover, if you've ever had red clover tea, it's used a lot for like women's issues. Like it's filled with minerals, and so it's especially like calcium, magnesium. Like very often it's put in like women's tea blends, but as long as you're not harvesting from a place that's been sprayed with chemicals, again, this is a pretty common lawn weed. So we want to make sure that wherever we're harvesting from, we're not spraying ourselves, and that we're also making sure that they haven't been kind of sprayed before. I think that's all my slides. I'm gonna skip back to the resources. And actually, because I did put together a resource sheet for you, I'm just gonna see if I click this and if it takes me to it. Ba-da-da! It's magic. Okay, so this is, I'm gonna take this link and I'm going to put it in the chat. So folks have access to it, they can open it. And anyway, so here is not all of the words that I said, but at least many of the words that were in the slideshow. So this is kind of the outline to remind you of what we sort of talked through. If you want to read a little bit about Robin Wall Kimmer, and there's an article from Yes Magazine about the honorable harvest. This is a really lovely thing to read, very short form. If you're looking to learn more, Braiding Sweetgrass is her book, and it's really lovely. This is just a list of the plants that we talked about very briefly, and their most common names, and then their botanical names. And some we have a common name that actually covers many different species. So like with hawthorn here, there's Crataegus monogyna, which is the European hawthorn, and then Crataegus douglasii, which is the native one to here. With roses, there's so many kinds of roses. Rosa rugosa is a plant that's planted usually on purpose, not a wild plant, but it's so rugged. It's very useful for planting in like the traffic circle or like along the shore, because it is very drought tolerant, salt tolerant, but it has big, incredibly fragrant flowers and then big old rose hips. Rosa nucana, which is our native Nootka rose. We have a few, 3 or 4 native roses here west of the Cascades that are pretty common. Some resources. So here is the noxious weed identification website with super helpful plant ID. Here's a link to the Burke Herbarium image collection. And so you can click on this and just type in it. They usually go by botanical names, so you'll have to put in like Conia maculatum, and then it'll show up all of the pictures of Conia maculatum, which is the poison hemlock. I put in some other things to watch here. There's a couple of TED Talks, one by Sean Sherman and one by who is the sous chef, right? Is that his name? He talks a lot about, in this TED Talk, talks a lot about the importance of indigenous foodways in the United States. We haven't had indigenous food as part of our collective American culture. And so he's trying to bring that to the forefront. And Valerie Segrist, who is native here, Muckleshoot, talks about Coast Salish foodways and kind of the importance of those traditional foods and the relationship with them, plants and animals. Alexis Nicole, she's out in Ohio, but she is really rad. She's had a lot of media exposure because she's very charming. I think she's like a plant nerd and a theater major, so she's got like that a little bit of both. She sings songs about cattails, and I think recently won a James Beard Award. But if you're on Instagram, she's at Black Forager, and if you're on TikTok, she's at Alexis Nicole. This tabloid Wild Harvest blog, he is the one that has a compiled information on regulations about foraging in public lands. I think he lives up in BC, but all of the information that he writes around is pretty relevant to most of the Pacific Northwest. Grub, which is Garden Raised Bounty, is an organization in Olympia, Washington, and they do wild food and medicine education program. Amongst many other things that they do as a nonprofit organization, they are doing a lot of rad things, but they have lots of great online resources that you can learn more specifically about plants. If you want to learn more about herbalism and foraging specifically for medicine plants in our area, Natalie Hammerquist, who runs the Adiantum School of Plant Medicine. She's Seattle based, but also I think she lives in Bellevue, so she might do stuff kind of like all around the county. There's a bunch of books down here to read. Some books. Nancy Turner is a ethnobotanist who is recording and has recorded a lot of sort of native indigenous foodways for our area, tribes that are in Coast Salish territory, and there's lots and lots of, if you're looking like just for a book to help you with plant identification, Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast by Pojar McKinnon is a pretty classic one. There's lots of things to explore here. Also, if you're a gardener, even if you're not a gardener, but you want like help with plant ID or organic land care, organic gardening, organic pest management. How do I like recycle my television? They can answer all of those questions. At the garden hotline, you can call them or email them, go to their website. Okay, I think I'm gonna stop my share. Sort of started talking really fast towards the end there, but I am happy to answer questions. It looks like a few more chat. I checked the chat during the break and then a few more things came up. Looks like the link is out. Okay, great. Sweet. Let's see, Emma, were there?
Yeah, there were some questions that came in that I gathered for you.
Cool.
So Lisa asked, my planted purslane grows upwards. The wild purslane spreads low to the ground. Are both edible?
Yeah, they are. I think a kind of cultivated purslane that you may have planted might be called golden purslane. It's got a bigger leaf and a smaller stem. That might be what it is. That's the only cultivated one I know specifically, but yeah, it grows up. Yeah, and then the weedy purslane or the common purslane grows prostrate. Sometimes it grows up, but it's like if it's boxed in with a bunch of other stuff, it's going to be kind of reaching for the sky. But they're both edible. They're both delicious. The weedy wild one tends to have thicker stems, bigger stems, and sometimes people will pickle the stems. Yeah.
Cool. Princess asked, does anyone have a recommendation for a good field guidebook for harvesting that can help me identify and properly harvest? I know you mentioned the Burke Herbarium, but maybe there are some other thoughts you have on that.
Yeah, so if it is for like plants out in natural ecosystems are like sort of broad, and native plants is sort of broader ecosystem plants. That Pojar McKinnon, it's what is it? It's actually called Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast, but most people that use that, I mean, it's a very commonly used book in like botany classes. Anyone that's learning native plants knows or learns that book, and people just call it Pojar McKinnon. So those are the people that are the main writers for the book. But if you're looking for like some of these more common ones, there is a book that from a guy down in Portland named John Callis that I have and use often, called Edible Wild Plants. And it has fewer plants in it, but it's like, it'll go into like, for like chickweed, it'll show you what chickweed looks like compared to other plants that look like it, what it looks like in its little cotyledon stage, what it looks like as an adult, some very specific identifying characteristics, what its flavor profile is, and then he's got some recipes. So it's really about eating wild plants, and it's like from identification to harvest to recipes and nutritional information. And those are going to be mostly leafy greens in that book. And they're going to be like pretty common weeds of cultivated human places. It's in the resource sheet, and it's just called Edible Wild Plants. Wild Foods from Dirt to Plate by John Callis, Kallas. And that's just one that I have used a lot because I own it. But I think that there are the library, like there are lots out there. And so like I really feel like the library can be helpful in navigating, like you can borrow a bunch of books and then see which ones you like. I think the cool thing about John Callis's book is that those books focus on plants that are common across the US, and actually you could probably find in most of the globe, but he's from here. So Samuel Thayer is also an author that has written 3 or 4 really good books about foraging wild plants. But he's in a different ecosystem. I think he's in the Midwest. So there are a lot of plants that he talks about that we don't have here. And so I see Jen Nicole is asking about trying to identify wild yam, and that it depends on what you mean by wild yam, because I think part of that is yam can mean a lot of things. And so if you can find the botanical name, that helps to narrow it down, and then find out if it's something that grows wild here, because it may be something that doesn't grow in our area in a wild way. It could be growing in a different place. So those are kind of the two pieces in trying to figure out that wild yam. Those are 2 questions I would ask. What is its botanical name? So we can ask about it specifically. Once you have the botanical name, you can just look on the Google and see what pops up, and then you can find pictures of it. Yeah. I see a question from Patricia. If I have most of these plants in my yard and garden, should I let them have rule over the space? That is a personal decision. And I think it depends on which of those plants you like or have use for. If it is a plant that you like, if you have tasted it, or if it is irritating to you, or like, I think there are plenty of plants that I have in my garden that are wild and are weedy, and some of them I find very useful, and some of them I don't have any use for. And so that's just a personal decision, and like how much space you have. If you have very small amount of space and you really need it for growing for tomatoes or zinnias, or like whatever is your priority, you may not have space to let all those things run wild. But yeah. And also your neighbors, if you've got dandelion seeds blowing into your neighbor's yard, they're probably gonna have a conversation with you about it too. So being mindful of what impact your yard has on others as well. Yeah. Oh, I see. Dioscorea vios, wild yam. Did you find out, you Googled it, did you find out if it grows here in our area? I'm curious. I might write that one down too.
Yeah, I didn't want to mispronounce it, but yeah, I did see that it grows I did see that wild yam grows in the area. I just
Cool.
didn't want to mispronounce it. Just butcher it.
Yeah. I would, I think that there's a combination of like doing your best you can do with field guides and identification, looking to see if there's a lookalike that may be dangerous. And then also, I mean, part of it is if you know anybody that knows that plant, see if you can go out with them and learn from them. I think that a lot of this, this sort of information about how we use plants for food and medicine is information when, as humans, when we spent more time doing this work, like in traditional land-based cultures where we spent a lot of time growing our food, we spent a lot of time processing our food, we made a lot of our own medicines for our family because going to the doctor was expensive or far away, or for whatever reasoning, or doctors hadn't been invented yet, like however far back your land-based ancestry goes, this information used to be passed down from generation to generation, and this used to be knowledge that was shown from person to person, and to have this ongoing relationship with the person that was sharing with you, but also the plants and the animals. And so it's going to take a little bit of time to feel comfortable with it, and just do it one plant at a time, I think, is my best advice. Yeah. I see, is there a hands-on class that we can take? And I do offer through Tilth like an in-person class. I'm doing one this Saturday, which is filled up. I think there's another in October, which it just went on the website, so there should be some space. But there's other folks that are teaching plant foraging, teaching wild plants, teaching plant medicine. And I think Natalie Hammerquist is one person specifically around plant medicine that she teaches, but there's other folks doing it. And actually, like, I do think that is really valuable to learn, if you can, to learn from Native people, to learn from people who are from this place. And if you have the opportunity to learn, those are like, I feel like that information is the most important or helpful information to learn, because they have, like 10,000 years of history of knowledge of this place embedded in their culture. And which makes me want to plug Colleen, Melissa Myers, also teaching. I don't know if you want to put a plug in for the next one in the series. She's a rad lady, and it's not an in-person class, but she has a lot of knowledge too. And
yeah, actually we can, I can share our next slides real quick.
Cool. Yeah. Awesome. I'm gonna.
There.
Okay. Oh, just to add the last thing from Patricia, the link for Tilth is tilthalliance.org. And I think it's in that resource sheet. It should be there somewhere. I see a lot of really specific plant questions coming up too, and I don't know that I can answer all the specific ones, but I think that I'm excited about that curiosity. And even if I can't answer those questions, those are great questions to ask people that books that you might find, internet articles that you might read.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm gonna mute myself. So thanks everybody. I really appreciate you being here and spending this evening with me.
Thank you so much, Carey. And again, for those who didn't hear before, this slide, the information in the slides will be made available. The recording will be made available. There's a lot of great resources that Carey shared that we can also pass on. So thank you again. And again, as mentioned before, this was sponsored by the Hazardous Waste Management Program of King County. We have a poll that's going to be launched. And please answer those. And I can't, FYI, Emma, I cannot see the poll, so I don't know when is a good time to,
It's launched.
it's launched. Please fill out. We would love to hear feedback of classes that you're interested in the future and what you thought of the presentation. And on the screen, I'm showing guys upcoming events that we have going on. We have a Repair Cafe coming up this Saturday at the South King Tool Library. And let me go back. And on September 14th, we have a healthy edible gardening. So it's a different class, but it's kind of linked to this. So if you're interested in that, please also sign up for that class. September 17th, we have a game swap that's happening. So if you have any games or puzzles, video game systems that you want to exchange or get rid of or look for yourself for new stuff, that's the place to be there on that date. We have shredding events and the class that Carey was talking about that Melissa Myers, is that right? That she is going to be teaching. That's on September 27th. Medicine plants in your backyard. So you might be interested in that as well. And you can sign up for our e-newsletter, which tells you all about these events. And a great question that somebody had, when you click on if you scan the code or if you go to that website, there's a list of a whole bunch of e-newsletters that the city sponsors. The one that we have, all of these recycling and our environmental services newsletter has recycling and stormwater information, and it has, you want to just click on environmental services. It says recycling and stormwater in parentheses. You can also follow us on Facebook, and we have most of all of these events also on Facebook as Facebook events.